found my son unconscious on the floor of his apartment while his wife was getting a spa treatment across town. The police called me because I was still listed as his emergency contact. She had never bothered to update it. I drove 90 miles in the dark wearing a paint-stained shirt and old work boots that had seen more honest labor than that woman would ever understand. When I walked into the ICU at Houston Methodist, the nurse at the desk looked me up and down like I had wandered in off a construction site. I probably had. She told me that the patient's spouse had already been notified. I told her I was his father. She told me visiting hours were over. I told her I wasn't leaving. My name is August Calloway. In the neighborhood where I raised my son, people know me as the retired electrician who still fixes porch lights for free and drives a dented Ford F-150 that should have been retired a decade ago. They see a man who keeps to himself, tends a small vegetable garden in the backyard, and watches football on a television that is not quite big enough for the living room. They do not know about the grid patents. They do not know about the 15 years I spent as the chief systems engineer for NextCore Energy, designing the underground power infrastructure for half the industrial corridor in the Gulf Coast. And they certainly do not know about the Calloway Family Trust, which I built over 40 years to make sure my son would never have to depend on anyone for anything. My son's name is Marcus. No. Wait. My son's name is Theo. Theodore Calloway Jr. He goes by Theo. Theodore Calloway Jr. He goes by Theo. He is 34 years old, a civil engineer who designs drainage systems for municipal projects. He is quiet, methodical, and so loyal it sometimes made me ache to watch. He married a woman named Vivienne 3 years ago at a ceremony in Galveston. I stood at the back of the venue in the suit I wore to his mother's funeral, and I watched Vivienne walk down the aisle in a dress that cost more than my truck. She was beautiful. She smiled at everyone. She shook my hand at the reception and told me she had always wanted a father figure in her life. I noticed even then that she said father figure, not father-in-law, not family, a figure, like a piece of furniture that fills a room. I stayed quiet. My son loved her. That was enough for me to give her a chance. I gave her 3 years. The call came at 11:47 on a Tuesday night in March. A Houston PD officer named Sergeant Delgado told me that my son had been found unresponsive in the kitchen of his home in the Heights neighborhood. A neighbor had heard something. The neighbor had called it in. The wife, Vivienne, could not be reached at the time of the call. I did not ask questions. I put on my boots and drove. The ICU at Houston Methodist smells like cold air and something chemical that coats the back of your throat. I have been in hospitals before. I know that smell. It is the smell of things being kept alive by machines instead of will. I walked down that hallway the same way I have walked into every difficult situation in my 61 years, slowly, eyes forward, hands steady. I found his room. Room 218. The door was open and there was a nurse adjusting an IV line, and Theo was in the bed and he looked the way no father should ever have to see his child look. Pale. Still. A monitor beeping in a rhythm that felt too slow, too uncertain, a tube in his arm, his hands at his sides. He had a traumatic brain injury from hitting the kitchen floor. The doctors told me later that he had been given a sedative. Not prescribed. Not from a pharmacy with his name on the bottle. Someone had given him enough Sedazolam to drop a man twice his size. The nurse told me his wife had been contacted. She said it with a very specific kind of careful professionalism that told me she was choosing not to say something else. "Where is she?" I asked. The nurse looked at the door. "She hasn't arrived yet," she said. I sat down in the chair beside my son's bed and I held his hand and I waited. Vivienne walked in at 2:15 in the morning. She was wearing a silk blouse and her hair was done, and she smelled like she had been somewhere that had good lighting and expensive candles. She looked at Theo in the bed for maybe 4 seconds. Then she looked at me. "August," she said, "you didn't need to come all this way." I looked at her. I kept my voice even. "He is my son." She nodded like I had said something mildly interesting. She set her purse on the chair in the corner. She did not go to him. She did not take his hand. She stood near the window with her arms crossed and looked at the monitor the way someone looks at a delayed flight board. "Do they know what happened?" I asked. "They think he fell," she said. "They think he fell," she said. "They think he fell." I did not say anything else that night. I sat in that room until the morning shift came in. Vivienne left around 4. She said she needed to get some rest. She said hospitals gave her anxiety. She kissed 2 fingers and pressed them against the doorframe on her way out, like she was leaving a nice restaurant. I watched her go. I felt something settle in my chest. It was not grief. It was not anger. Not yet. It was that cold, specific clarity that comes when you have been an engineer long enough to recognize when something has been designed to fail. In the morning, I called a man named Garrett Boone. Garrett was my attorney for 22 years. He picked up on the second ring even though it was before 7, because Garrett Boone had built his career on being available when the people he represented needed him most. I told him what I knew. I told him about the sedative. I told him about the timeline. I told him about Vivienne's face when she walked in. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How deep do you want to go?" "All the way," I said. He said, "Give me 48 hours. While Garrett worked, I stayed at the hospital. I slept in the chair. I ate vending machine food. I watched the nurses, and I watched the doctors, and I watched the door. On the second day, a man I did not recognize came to the room. He was younger than me. Well-dressed, he introduced himself as Colton, a financial advisor, and he said he was there on behalf of Vivienne to discuss some administrative matters related to Theo's medical situation. I asked him what administrative matters. He said there was a life insurance policy that had been recently updated, and given the severity of Theo's condition, Vivienne wanted to ensure the documentation was in order. I looked at this man, Colton, and I kept my face completely still the way my father taught me when I was 8 years old, standing in front of a man who thought he could shortchange us on a contract. "When was the policy updated?" I asked. He hesitated. "Recently," he said. "How recently?" "6 weeks ago," he said. I nodded slowly. I told him that all matters related to my son's finances would need to go through his legal representative going forward. I told him that if he had further questions, he could contact Garrett Boone at the Boone Law Group in Houston. I handed him one of Garrett's cards. I had kept 3 in my wallet for exactly these kinds of moments. Colton left without saying much else. I called Garrett and told him about the insurance policy. Garrett said, "That is not a coincidence, August." "I know," I said. He said the policy was worth $800,000. Double indemnity for accidental death. It had been signed 6 weeks ago. The beneficiary was Vivienne. The signature on the policy had been witnessed by a woman named Dana, who, as Garrett discovered by end of day, was Vivienne's college roommate and current closest friend. A policy signed 6 weeks before a husband ends up unconscious on his kitchen floor with a foreign sedative in his bloodstream. I sat with that information for a while. Engineers do not panic. We assess. We look at the load-bearing points and we figure out where the structure is weakest, and we work from there. On the 3rd day, Theo opened his eyes. He was confused at first, disoriented. He did not know what day it was. He did not know how he had gotten to the hospital. The doctor said that was normal given what had been in his system. I held his hand and told him I was there. He looked at me and his eyes filled up in that way that grown men's eyes do when they are scared and trying not to show it. He said, "Dad, what happened?" I said, "We are going to figure that out together." He asked for Vivienne. I told him she had been by. I did not tell him she had spent less time in his room than it takes to heat up a cup of coffee. He fell asleep again. I stepped outside. The hospital had a small garden area on the ground floor, a concrete patio with potted plants and a wooden bench. I sat there and I called Garrett. He had the reports from the toxicology screen. The sedative in Theo's bloodstream was not something you could buy at a grocery store. It was the kind of compound used in clinical settings, the kind that had to be prescribed or stolen from a medical facility. Garrett had already started pulling Vivienne's background. What he found was this. Before she met Theo, Vivienne had been briefly engaged to a man in Dallas named Sutton, a real estate developer. The engagement ended abruptly when Sutton's business partner filed a complaint with his attorney claiming that Vivienne had accessed Sutton's financial accounts without authorization. No charges were filed. Sutton had quietly paid a settlement and moved on. He had wanted to put it behind him. Vivienne had been practicing. I walked back to the hospital. I took the stairs instead of the elevator because I needed a minute to think. By the time I reached the second-floor landing, I had decided what needed to happen next. I called Garrett back. "Initiate the lockdown," I said. "Everything connected to the Calloway Trust comes out of her reach immediately." The joint account Theo and Vivienne shared was funded partially by a monthly distribution from the trust. That distribution stops as of today. The house in the Heights was purchased with a combination of Theo's income and a trust loan that I had personally guaranteed. I wanted that loan called in, not aggressively, quietly, like a hand closing around a door handle from the other side. Garrett said, "That will dry up her liquidity fast." "Good," I said. He said, "She will come after you." I said, "Lee would come after you." I said, "Let her." She came after me on a Friday afternoon. I was sitting in the family waiting area on the second floor when she appeared at the end of the hall. She was not alone. She had a man with her who I did not recognize. Tall, square jaw, he walked the way men walk when they have been told to look intimidating. She sat down across from me. She put her hands in her lap and she tilted her head the way she always did when she was about to say something that she had rehearsed. "August," she said, "I think we need to clear the air." "Go ahead," I said. She said that she understood I was worried about Theo. She said she was worried too. She said we both wanted the same thing, for him to get better and come home. She said she thought I had been interfering with his medical care and that her attorney had advised her she had grounds to request that my access to Theo's room be limited. I looked at her. I looked at the man with her. Then I looked back at her. "Your attorney," I said. She nodded. I reached into my jacket and I pulled out a folded document. I handed it across to her. She took it. She unfolded it. The man with her leaned over to read it. It was a healthcare directive, notarized and filed with the state of Texas 11 years ago. It granted me full medical decision-making authority for Theodore Calloway Jr. in the event of incapacitation. It superseded any authority held by a spouse. It had been drafted by Garrett Boone and reviewed by two separate healthcare attorneys. It was, as Garrett liked to say, bulletproof. Vivienne read it twice. The color did not leave her face. The color had never really been in her face to begin with. She handed it back. She said, "We will see about that." I folded it and put it back in my pocket. "We will," I said. She stood up. The man with her stood up. She said, "I am going to see my husband now." I said, "Of course. I will walk with you." She did not like that. But she did not say anything. We walked together down the hall to room 218. A nurse met us at the door and told Vivienne that Theo had asked to rest and was not taking visitors at the moment. Vivienne's jaw tightened. She looked at the nurse, then at me. The nurse smiled politely and held the door half closed. "That is fine," I said to Vivienne. "I will let you know when he is ready." She left. The man with her left. I went inside and sat back down in my chair. Theo was not asleep. He was lying still, but his eyes were open. He had heard some of it. Maybe all of it. He said, "She didn't come the first night, did she?" I did not answer right away. He said, "Dad, tell me the truth." I said, "She came on the second day." He looked at the ceiling. His jaw moved. He did not cry. My son never cried in front of me, and I did not ask him to start now. I just sat there and let the truth settle over him the way it settles, slowly like sediment finding the bottom of still water. He said, "What did Garrett find?" I told him. I told him about the insurance policy. I told him about the sedative compound. I told him about Sutton and Dallas. I told him about the trust distribution being frozen. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "How long has she been planning this?" I said I did not know exactly. But I said that a woman who did what she did to the man in Dallas had been thinking about it for longer than 6 weeks. He said, "I thought she loved me." I said, "I know you did." He said, "I should have listened to you." I said, "You listened to your heart. That is not something to be ashamed of. What comes next is what matters." He looked at me. He said, "What comes next is what matters." He said, "What comes next?" I said, "We end it." Garrett filed the petition to nullify the insurance policy that same week, citing material misrepresentation and fraud. The forensic accountants he brought in spent 3 days going through the joint account records. What they found was methodical and patient. Over 18 months, Vivienne had been making small transfers, never large enough to trigger an automatic alert. Always on weekdays, always to an account that had a generic name, a shell with a Memphis mailing address that turned out to belong to a limited liability company with one member. Her. She had moved $62,000 out of the joint account into her own LLC. She had reported it to nobody. She had told Theo it was for home renovations. The permit records for the Heights house showed no renovations had been applied for or completed. She had also, and this was where Garrett got very quiet on the phone when he told me, taken out a second mortgage on the house using a signature that the handwriting analyst said was not consistent with Theo's known writing samples. He was close. He was very close, but the pressure pattern was wrong. Theo was right-handed and pressed hard when he signed. The signature on the mortgage was light. Practiced, but light. She had forged his name to borrow $120,000 against the house they lived in. I sat in my truck in the hospital parking garage after Garrett told me that, and I held the steering wheel and I stared at the concrete wall in front of me. Not because I was surprised, but because I needed a moment to absorb the specific kind of cold rage that comes when you realize someone looked at your child and saw an opportunity. I had one more thing to do before I closed the net. Vivienne had a sister. Her name was Petra. She was 4 years younger, quieter, and had called me twice during the time Theo was in the ICU to ask if there was anything she could do. I had taken the calls but kept them brief. Now I called her back. I asked Petra directly. I asked her if she knew what her sister had been doing. There was a long silence on the line. Then Petra said, "I didn't know everything, but I knew something was wrong." I asked her what she knew. She told me that 2 months before Theo's hospitalization, Vivienne had asked her to hold on to some money. Cash. $15,000. She said it was for an investment and she needed it kept off her personal records temporarily. Petra had put it in a shoebox in her closet because she did not know what else to do, and she was afraid of her sister, and she did not know how to say no to her. I asked Petra if she still had the money. She said, yes. I said, I need you to do something very hard. I need you to talk to my attorney and tell him what you just told me. She said, Vivienne will never forgive me. I said, Petra, your sister put a sedative in your brother-in-law's food and left him on a kitchen floor. Forgiveness is not the issue right now. She was crying by the end of the call. I waited until she was done. Then I gave her Garrett's number. The morning that Vivienne came to the hospital with her own attorney, a man named Royce from a firm downtown, I was already in the hallway. I had been there since 7. I had brought coffee from the cart downstairs, one for me and one for the floor nurse who had been looking out for Theo all week, a woman named Adeline who had earned more of my respect in 5 days than most people earn in years. Royce was a polished man, expensive suit, good shoes. He carried himself with the particular confidence of someone who is used to walking into rooms and having them reorganize around him. He looked at me and then he looked at my boots, and then he looked at my boots and then he looked back at his client. He said, Mr. Calloway. His tone said what his words did not. It said, this will be brief. He laid out his position. He said that as Theo's legal spouse, Vivienne had primary rights regarding his medical care and financial affairs. He said the healthcare directive I held was being contested on the grounds that Theo had been of diminished capacity when it was signed, a claim that was not only false, but that Garrett had told me they might try. He said that Vivienne was prepared to seek an emergency injunction to remove me from the property. I let him finish. Then I asked him a single question. I asked him if he had done a conflict check on his client before taking her case. He said he didn't see how that was relevant. I said, Royce, I sit on the board of the Morrison Group. The Morrison Group is the parent company of the legal services consortium that employs your firm as outside counsel on 3 active infrastructure contracts. I have been on that board for 9 years. I am not telling you this to threaten you. I am telling you so that you can make an informed decision about how you want your Friday morning to proceed. He looked at me. He did not say anything for about 4 seconds. Then he looked at Vivienne. Something passed between them. Then he excused himself to make a phone call. He did not come back. Vivienne stood in the hallway alone. She looked at the door to Theo's room. She looked at me. She had run out of hired armor. I said, It is over, Vivienne. She said, You don't know what you've done. I said, You don't know what you've done. I said, I know exactly what I have done. I have protected my son. That is the only job I ever had. She said he was going to leave me anyway. He didn't love me the way I needed. I looked at her. I thought about all the ways a person tells themselves a story to justify what they have chosen to do. I thought about all the ways love gets rewritten after the fact into a transaction that someone else failed to honor. I said, that may be true, but there is a legal way to leave a marriage and a criminal way. You chose the second one. She left the hospital without going into his room. 2 weeks later, the Houston Police Department arrested Vivienne at her sister's apartment, where she had been staying after the joint account was frozen, and a house in the Heights went into legal dispute. The charges included 1 count of aggravated assault causing bodily harm, 1 count of insurance fraud, 2 counts of forgery, and 1 count of financial exploitation of a household member. Petra had given her statement to Garrett and then to the DA's office. The shoebox was in evidence. Theo was released from the hospital on a Thursday. I drove him home in my truck. He did not say much for the first few miles. The Houston skyline sat in the late afternoon haze, and he watched it through the window with the particular expression of someone seeing a place they have lived in for years and not quite recognizing it yet. He said, "What happens to the house?" I said, "The court will sort out the lien from the forged mortgage. It will take time, but it will be resolved. You will not lose it." He said, "I don't want it." I understood that. I said, "Then we will sell it, and you will find something that feels like yours." He nodded. He looked at his hands in his lap. He said, "I keep thinking about what I missed. What I should have seen." I said, "You loved someone, and you trusted them. That is not a failure. That is just what people do when they let someone in. The failure would have been letting her take everything and never fighting back." He said, "You fought back." I said, "We did." He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "How did you know?" "From the beginning." "How did you know she wasn't right?" I thought about how to answer that. I thought about the first time I met her, the handshake, the words "father figure," the way she filed every person in a room by what they could offer her. I said, "She looked at you the way some people look at houses they can't afford yet, like something to eventually acquire." He let out a long, slow breath. He said, "That is a terrible way to love someone." I said, "It was not love. It just wore the same coat for a while." He looked out the window again. The highway opened up past the loop, and the afternoon light went long and flat over the Texas landscape. He said, "I want to build something. After all this, I want to work on something real." I said, "I have a project." He looked at me. I said, "I bought a piece of land outside of Katy 3 years ago, 12 acres. I was going to put up a small structure, workshop, storage, but I never got around to it. I thought maybe we could design something together, something worth keeping." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How many stories?" I said, "As many as you want." He almost smiled. It was small. It was just at the edge of his mouth, but it was there, and it was real, and it was the first thing that felt like morning after a very long night. The trial took 8 months. I sat in the gallery on the first day and watched Vivienne walk in. She was dressed carefully, conservatively, the way a person dresses when they want to look like someone they are not. Her attorney, a public defender named Ms. Ashby, was competent and clearly exhausted. Vivienne's original lawyer, Royce, had withdrawn from the case within 48 hours of our conversation in the hallway, citing a conflict of interest. The prosecution presented the toxicology report. They presented the insurance policy timeline. They presented the forgery analysis on the mortgage signature. They presented the LLC records and the 18 months of small transfers. They presented Petra's testimony, delivered quietly and without embellishment by a woman who looked like she had been carrying something heavy for too long and was relieved to finally set it down. Vivienne's defense argued diminished emotional capacity. They argued the marriage had been volatile and that her actions were born from desperation and fear. They found a psychologist who talked about attachment disorders and financial anxiety and relationship trauma. The jury listened. Then the DA played a recording. It came from Vivienne's own phone, retrieved during the investigation. It was a voice memo she had made to herself approximately 1 week before Theo's hospitalization. In it, she walked through a timeline. The policy. The forged mortgage. The compound. She referred to Theo by name twice. Her voice was calm and detailed, and she said, at one point with no particular emotion, "If this works out the way I need it to, I will be set for 10 years minimum." That was not a woman acting from desperation. That was a woman who had made a plan. The jury came back in 4 hours, guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 14 years. She would be eligible for parole in 11, which meant she would walk out of a Texas state correctional facility when Theo was 45 years old and had, I was confident, built something worth far more than anything she had tried to take. As the bailiffs moved her toward the door, Vivienne turned and looked at the gallery. She found me. I do not know what she was looking for. An apology, maybe. Or acknowledgement. Some sign that she had mattered enough to have been worth fighting. I looked back at her. I did not look away, and I did not look down. Then Theo stood up beside me. He did not speak to her. He did not need to. He just stood there, next to his father. Straight-backed, quiet, present. 2 men who had come through something together. Vivienne looked at us for a long moment, then the door closed. We walked out of the courthouse into a September afternoon in Houston, the air still thick and warm. Theo put his hands in his pockets and we walked to the truck without talking. When we got in, he sat for a moment with his hands on his knees. He said, "It doesn't feel like I thought it would." I said, "What did you think it would feel like?" He said, "Bigger. I thought I would feel something bigger." I said, "That feeling comes later, when you are not thinking about it, when you are working on something and you realize you have not thought about her in a week. That is when it hits you. Not that it is over. That you are still here." He nodded slowly. He looked out through the windshield at the courthouse steps, at the people moving past, at the ordinary Thursday afternoon unfolding around the worst and best day of the year. Then he picked up his phone. He opened his drafting app. He turned the screen toward me. He had drawn a rough floor plan, clean lines. An open central structure with two wings extending east and west, oriented to catch the prevailing breeze off the Texas plain. He said, "I was thinking about the Katy property." I looked at the plans. I looked at the orientation. I said, "You angled the main opening 15 degrees south-southwest. That catches the summer wind." He said, "I know. I measured the site last week. I turned the key in the ignition." I said, "How many square feet?" He said, "Enough." I put the truck in gear and we drove. Behind us, the courthouse got smaller in the rearview mirror. The city opened up into the wide, flat Texas horizon, and the sky was enormous and faintly orange at the edges, the way it gets in September when the light starts to shift toward fall. My son had his phone in his hand, and he was sketching something new. I had kept my promise. I had done the only thing that ever mattered. And somewhere behind us, in a room with a locked door and a very long calendar, the woman who had mistaken my son for a transaction was beginning to understand exactly what she had walked away from. Not the money, not the house, not the policy. She had walked away from this, from a man who would stand beside his father on a Thursday afternoon and point toward something he intended to build. You cannot put a number on that. You can only make sure you are still standing when it is done. If this story found you at the right time, hit that like button and subscribe to Candy Revenge for more stories about justice, family, and the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. And tell me in the comments, has someone ever looked at you or someone you love like you were just a means to an end? What did you do about it? I read every single one. I have been building things my whole life. Power grids, underground systems, infrastructure that most people never see and never think about. The work taught me one thing above everything else. The foundation always tells the truth eventually. You can pour bad concrete and paint over it and it will hold for a while. It will hold long enough to fool most people. But pressure finds the weak point. It always does. That is not a philosophy. That is just physics. Vivienne was bad concrete. I knew it from the first handshake, not because she was poor, or because she came from somewhere difficult, or because she wanted a better life. Wanting a better life is human. I respect that. What I saw in her eyes was something different. I saw a person who had decided that the fastest way to what she wanted was through someone else's door rather than her own. And when you have spent 61 years building things from the ground up, you can spot that calculation in about 4 seconds. What I did not do was act on it, because my son loved her. And a father's job is not to run every person in his child's life through a background check. His job is to pay attention and be ready. I was ready. Here is what I have come to understand about people like Vivienne. The plan is always more fragile than it looks. It depends entirely on everyone around them staying passive, staying confused, staying too polite to ask direct questions or too afraid to make uncomfortable calls. The moment one person in the circle decides to stop being polite and start being clear, the whole architecture collapses, because it was never built on anything real. It was built on other people's willingness to look away. I stopped looking away. Theo asked me in the truck that Thursday after the verdict how I had known from the beginning. I told him she looked at him like something to acquire. He said that was a terrible way to love someone, and I have been thinking about that sentence ever since, because he was right. It is not just terrible. It is a choice. Every day that Vivienne moved money out of that account, every time she practiced that signature, every time she calculated the payout on a policy she had taken out on the man she was supposed to protect, she chose that. Nobody made her. No circumstance forced her hand. She was not desperate. She was planning. There is a difference between a person who makes a terrible decision under pressure and a person who makes a calm, detailed voice memo walking through the timeline of their husband's death. One deserves some compassion. The other deserves exactly what she got. What I want to say to anyone watching this is something simple. Strength does not have to announce itself. For most of my adult life, I drove a dented truck and wore work boots and let people assume what they were going to assume. That is fine. Let them assume. The assuming is what keeps them careless, and careless people always show you the plan eventually. Protect what matters quietly. Build your foundation deep, and when someone looks at the people you love and sees only a number, make sure you are already standing between them and the door. Theo is fine. He is better than fine. He is drawing plans for something that will outlast all of this. That is enough for me. That has always been enough.